Why did the status of unmarried women frighten Victorian society? You will be shocked to learn the truth. Her existence challenged the very foundations of a society where a woman's place was clearly defined. First as a daughter, then as a wife, then as a mother. A woman outside the system was an anomaly, a living reproach, and a silent threat. She was a mystery that Victorian society could not solve, and therefore preferred to fear. Watch the video to the end to learn how the legal status of unmarried women made them freer than married women, and why society created the caricature of the old maid to neutralize this frightening freedom. The hidden truth that everyone kept quiet about was that an unmarried woman in the Victorian era was a kind of social ghost. She was physically present at family dinners and in church pews, but in the social structure, there was no designated place or clear role for her. She was not the head of the household like a married woman, nor was she a future housewife like a young girl of marriageable age. This uncertainty made her invisible to a system built on marital unions. Without a husband, a woman had no clear social status. Her position depended entirely on the family in which she lived, first on her father, and then possibly on her brother or another male relative. She was a permanent guest in someone else's house. In the eyes of society, her life was considered incomplete, devoid of a main purpose. It was assumed that her only purpose was to serve others without having any ambitions of her own. This role made her convenient, but deprived of personality. She was a living reminder that the system was not perfect. Her existence proved that not every woman could or wanted to follow the prescribed path. This silent inconsistency caused a dull irritation. In documents and censuses, she was often described through her relationships with men. She was the daughter of so-and-so or the sister of so-and-so. On her own, as an independent entity, she hardly existed. The absence of a specific function in society turned her into an observer rather than a participant in life. She saw everything from the sidelines, remaining behind the scenes of family dramas and triumphs. This position gave her a unique but frightening perspective. Her figure was blurred, lacking clear contours. She was someone who was spoken of in hushed tones, pitied or neglected. But behind this pity lay a fear of the unknown, which she embodied. In essence, she was a person for whom no script had been written. In the rigidly regulated Victorian world, this was tantamount to social heresy. Her life was a blank page that society was afraid to fill. This emptiness and uncertainty were more frightening than open rebellion. She was a passive threat, her very existence calling into question the immutability of the established order. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how modern society treats people who do not fit into the accepted norms? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready for the shocking truth? One of the fundamental reasons for the fear of unmarried women was simple and inexorable mathematics. Demographic data from the mid-19th century in Great Britain showed a significant surplus of women compared to men. For every 100 men, there were about 104 women. This seemingly small difference on a national scale created hundreds of thousands of surplus women. There were simply not enough potential husbands for them. The reasons for this imbalance were varied. High infant mortality among boys and active emigration of men to the colonies in search of a better life. The Army and Navy also took a significant portion of the male population. Thus, for many Victorian women, celibacy was not a choice, but an inevitability. Even the most beautiful, educated, and virtuous girls could be left without a partner. It was a cruel lottery in which many were unlucky. Society was faced with a problem of its own making. It extolled marriage as the only worthy destiny for a woman, but at the same time, it could not provide this destiny for everyone. This demographic fact undermined the very idea that every woman was made for marriage. If that were the case, then nature or God had made a serious mistake in their calculations. Such a thought was uncomfortable and even seditious. The term surplus woman itself was humiliating. It reduced a person to a statistical error. A woman was perceived not as a human being, but as a unit that had not found its counterpart. This surplus created competition in the marriage market. Families with daughters of marriageable age made enormous efforts to secure a good match for them. An unmarried relative was a living reminder of possible failure. Thus, the fear of unmarried women was partly a fear of harsh reality. She was proof that the ideal family model was unattainable for everyone. How should society deal with thousands of educated women for whom there were simply no husbands? In the next chapter, you will learn about a legal secret that made unmarried women freer than married women. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian law. The fact is that, according to the law, an unmarried woman, known as a femme sole, had a remarkable amount of rights. She could own property and land in her own name. She had the right to enter into contracts and run her own business. She could also sue and be sued as an independent legal entity. In essence, she was almost equal to a man in the eyes of the law. But everything changed dramatically when a woman got married. She became a femme covert, a woman undercover. Her legal personality was completely absorbed by that of her husband. From that moment on, she could no longer own property. All her assets, including her dowry and inheritance, automatically passed under the control of her spouse. He could dispose of them at his discretion. A married woman could not sign contracts without her husband's consent. She did not even have legal rights to the money she earned. It also belonged to him. This legal doctrine was called coverture. It was based on the idea that a husband and wife were one entity, and that entity was the husband. The wife was under his protection, but that protection came at the cost of her freedom. Thus, despite all the social pressure, an unmarried woman was, from a legal point of view, a much freer and more independent person. She retained control over her life and finances. It was this freedom that was feared. The idea that a woman could consciously choose celibacy in order to retain her property and independence was subversive. It contradicted the entire ideology of patriarchal society. After all, it meant that marriage was not a blessing, but a legal trap. This legal paradox created enormous tension. Society extolled marriage, but the law made it an act of complete subjugation for women. An unmarried woman was the living embodiment of this uncomfortable truth. Later, with the passage of the Married Women's Property Acts in the second half of the century, the situation began to change. But for most of the era, it was the status of femme sole that was the only way for a woman to retain her legal and economic autonomy. And this was a fact that Victorian society preferred not to publicize. What you are about to learn will turn your perception of the Victorian family upside down. Behind the sentimental images lay a harsh economic reality. In this reality, an unmarried daughter or sister was often perceived as a financial burden. In an ideal world, a daughter was supposed to marry and become the responsibility of her husband. This was not only a social transition, but also an economic one. The responsibility for her maintenance was transferred to another family. If this did not happen, she remained in the care of her own family. Her father, and after his death, her brothers, were obliged to provide for her for the rest of her life. It was a lifelong financial responsibility. For middle-class families, where budgets were strictly planned, this could be a serious problem. Supporting an unmarried relative meant additional expenses. This money could have been spent on the education of sons or dowries for other daughters. Therefore, her presence in the home could cause hidden or even open irritation. She was perceived as a person who had not fulfilled her economic function. She was a liability, not an asset, in the family economy. In addition, her unmarried status cast a shadow on the family's reputation. It could mean that she did not have a sufficient dowry, or that her father had been unable to find her a suitable match, which spoke to his inability to conduct business. To compensate for her maintenance in some way, an unmarried woman often took on the role of an unpaid assistant. She cared for sick relatives and helped raise her nephews and nieces. Her work was taken for granted. She became an auntie, a universal resource for the whole family. She was used to perform duties that others did not have time for. At the same time, her own needs and desires were often ignored. This fear of economic burden was very strong. It forced parents to make every effort to marry off their daughters. Sometimes this led to loveless marriages based solely on calculation. Thus, an unmarried woman was feared not only as a social anomaly, but also as a potential drain on the family budget. What options were open to a woman who could not or did not want to marry? In the next chapter, you will learn about the most common, but also the most humiliating profession for a woman from a good family. For an unmarried middle-class woman who was educated but had no means of support, the choice of professions was extremely limited. The most common and socially acceptable option was to work as a governess. However, this role placed women in a painful and ambiguous position. A governess was not a servant, but she was not a member of the family either. She was a lady by birth and education, but at the same time she was a hired worker who received a salary for her labor. This intermediate position led to constant loneliness. The servants treated her with suspicion, as an outsider from the upper class, and the owners of the house kept her at a distance to emphasize her subordinate status. She dined alone after the children had been fed. She spent her evenings in her room, excluded from the family circle in the living room. Her life was spent in isolation under someone else's roof. Her work was exhausting and thankless. She was fully responsible for the education and manners of her pupils. But at the same time, she had no real authority and often faced capriciousness and disobedience. A governess's salary was very low. Often it was barely enough to buy modest clothes and set aside a pittance for old age. There was no question of financial independence. Her future was uncertain and bleak. When her pupils grew up, she became unnecessary. She had to look for a new job, proving her competence over and over again. The governess was a symbol of female vulnerability. Her position demonstrated what could happen to a woman from a good family if she did not have a husband or wealth. She was a living warning to others. Thus, even an unmarried woman who was taken in remained a source of discomfort. She was a constant reminder of the fragility of a woman's fate. Her quiet, independent life was a reality that was feared and avoided at all costs. This is what happens behind the closed doors of Victorian living rooms. One of the most effective ways to control unmarried women was to create and maintain a derogatory stereotype. Society turned the figure of the single woman into a caricature known as the old maid. This image was deliberately endowed with the most repulsive traits. The old maid was portrayed as a mean, quarrelsome, and perpetually dissatisfied person. It was believed that the absence of family life had made her character unbearable. She was credited with a passion for gossip and intrigue. In novels and plays, she often appeared as a character who sowed discord and interfered in other people's affairs. This was a reflection of the fear of her observant nature and abundance of free time. The appearance of the caricatured old maid was also unattractive. She was depicted as thin, angular, and unfashionably dressed. This image was intended to emphasize her unwantedness among men. Another typical feature was eccentricity. It was believed that a solitary life led to the development of strange habits and quirks. This portrayed her as abnormal, deviating from the generally accepted standard. This stereotype was a powerful tool of social pressure. It served as a scare tactic for young girls. They were told, "Get married or you will turn into a pitiful and ridiculous creature." This image was so powerful that many women feared it like fire. They tried not to display traits that could be associated with an old maid. They suppressed their intellect, hid their opinions, and tried to be as inconspicuous as possible. In reality, many unmarried women were educated, kind, and active. They were involved in charity work, wrote books, and cared for their relatives. But the culture preferred to see them only as caricatures. The creation of this repulsive image was a form of psychological warfare. It was designed to deprive unmarried women of their dignity and devalue their life choices. Why was it so important for society to create this repulsive image? But at the end of the era, this caricature was replaced by a new, far more frightening figure. In the next chapter, you will learn about the new woman who openly challenged the entire Victorian world. In the last decades of the Victorian era, a figure appeared on the scene who no longer provoked ridicule, but genuine fear. This was the new woman. She was a direct and conscious challenge to the patriarchal order. The new woman was educated. Thanks to the opening of women's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, she had access to knowledge previously available only to men. She had no intention of hiding this intellect. She strove for economic independence. She mastered new professions, becoming a typist, journalist, or doctor. Work for her was not a bitter necessity, but a form of self-realization. The new woman often consciously refused marriage. She saw it not as the only goal, but only as one of many possible paths in life. Sometimes she considered it a form of slavery that restricted her freedom. She led an active lifestyle. One of her symbols was the bicycle, which gave her unprecedented freedom of movement. She wore more practical clothes, rejecting tight corsets. She spoke openly about social issues and fought for her rights. She was an active participant in the suffrage movement, demanding voting rights for women. Her voice was loud and confident. Unlike the submissive old maid, the new woman did not seek society's approval. She created her own rules and communities. She was confident in herself and her convictions. The conservative press portrayed her as a threat to the family and the nation. She was accused of selfishness and of rejecting the sacred duty of motherhood. Her independence was perceived as unfeminine. She was frightening because she was a harbinger of the future. Victorian society saw in her the impending collapse of the familiar world. She was not just an anomaly, but a revolution. The figure of the new woman showed that the fear of unmarried women was not unfounded. As soon as women gained access to education and economic opportunities, they began to question the foundations of patriarchy. This was the main nightmare of Victorian society. In the world of the Victorian aristocracy and bourgeoisie, marriage was not so much a union of hearts as a financial transaction. It served as an essential tool for preserving and increasing family capital, and an unmarried woman could disrupt this well-oiled system. The basic principle of inheritance was patrilineal. Wealth and property had to be passed down through the male line. Women were merely a conduit for this transfer, bringing their dowry from their father's family to their husband's family. Entire fortunes, estates, and titles depended on properly arranged marriages. A union with an heiress could save a ruined aristocratic family, and the marriage of a daughter to a wealthy man could strengthen the position of her own family. An unmarried female heiress was a serious problem. If she did not marry, her fortune remained under her own control. She could dispose of it as she saw fit. After the adoption of the Acts on the Property of Married Women, this threat became even more real. Now, even after marriage, a woman retained the rights to her property, but an unmarried woman had even greater freedom of action. They could bequeath their money and land to anyone they wanted, for example, to a charitable organization, another woman, or a distant relative. This disrupted the direct flow of capital from father to son-in-law and grandchildren. She was an unpredictable economic agent in a system that sought maximum predictability. Her personal decisions could affect the fate of entire dynasties. This gave her hidden but enormous power. Families made enormous efforts to control unmarried female heirs. They were pressured to marry the right candidate. Male relatives often tried to take control of their financial affairs. The fear of losing control over capital was one of the strongest. It was more important than moral or social considerations. Money and property were the basis of the Victorian elite's power. Thus, an unmarried woman was feared not only as a social outsider, but also as a potential disruptor of the economic order. She was a figure who could remove assets from the patriarchal system. In a world where everything was subject to inheritance, this was a serious crime. An unmarried woman who was not under the direct authority of her father or husband was perceived as a potential source of moral instability. Her freedom was suspicious. It was believed that a woman without male guidance could easily stray from the true path. Therefore, her life was subject to constant public scrutiny. Her every move, every acquaintance, every action was examined under a microscope. She was watched by her neighbors, relatives, and the entire local community. Her reputation was her most valuable and at the same time, most fragile asset. The slightest misstep or even an unfounded rumor could ruin her forever. She lived in constant fear of making a mistake. She was subject to a special, stricter code of conduct. She could not travel freely alone. She could not receive male guests at her home without a chaperone present. Any display of independence or originality in judgment could be interpreted as a sign of bad character. She was expected to be modest, submissive, and lead an almost monastic lifestyle. She had to be inconspicuous. This total control was a way of neutralizing her potential danger. Society placed her in an invisible cage of rules and conventions. This prevented her from exercising her freedom. Her communication with men was considered particularly suspicious. Any friendship could be interpreted as an inappropriate relationship. She was constantly suspected of having secret romantic or selfish intentions. This moral terror was an effective means of suppression. It forced many women to lead secluded and restricted lives. They were afraid to step outside the boundaries for fear of condemnation. The fear of female sexuality uncontrolled by the bonds of marriage was one of the main driving forces behind this surveillance. An unmarried woman was a free agent. This meant she was a threat to strict Victorian morality, which was based on total control. Ultimately, society feared not so much her actual actions as the very possibility of those actions. Her independent status set a precedent, and that precedent had to be surrounded by a wall of prohibitions and suspicions. In summary, it can be said that Victorian society's deep fear of unmarried women was a fear of chaos. She was a living symbol of disorder in a world obsessed with order. Her existence was a crack in the monolithic edifice of patriarchy. The entire Victorian civilization was built on the family as the basic unit. The family headed by the father was a microcosm of the state, headed by the monarch. This structure was considered the only possible and God-pleasing one. In this model, everyone had their own clear function. The man was the breadwinner and protector. The woman was the angel of the house, the keeper of the hearth and morals. An unmarried woman fell outside this orderly system. She had no cell of her own, no prescribed function. She was an element that did not fit into the scheme. Her existence, voluntary or involuntary, proved that this scheme was not universal. It hinted that other forms of life were possible. This idea was subversive because it called into question the immutability of the entire social order. If a woman could live her life without a husband, then a man was not so necessary. If she could manage her own property, then the patriarchal system of inheritance was not the only one. If she could find self-fulfillment outside the family, then the role of angel in the home was not the limit of women's dreams. Each of these conclusions struck at the heart of Victorian ideology. Therefore, the figure of the unmarried woman had to be marginalized. She had to be made either pitiful or depraved so that no one would want to follow her example. She was not just a person, but an idea. The idea that a woman could exist as a self-sufficient person. In the 19th century, this idea was more frightening than any social upheaval. She was a living paradox. Society simultaneously pitied and feared her, cared for and oppressed her. Her fate reflected, like a mirror, all the hidden contradictions and fears of a great but very fragile era. Ultimately, Victorian society's struggle with unmarried women was a struggle with the future, a future in which women would have choices. And as we know, that future eventually arrived. We can see that the fear of unmarried women in the Victorian era was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. She was a demographic problem, an economic burden, a legal anomaly, and a moral threat. But above all, she was a symbol of uncontrolled freedom in a society that valued control above all else. Her figure forced Victorians to confront uncomfortable questions about the structure of their own world. And instead of seeking answers, society chose to turn this woman into an object of pity, ridicule, and suspicion. It was a quiet but cruel war against those who did not fit into the mold. The story of the Old Maid is not just a tale of the past. It is a reminder of how any society treats those who choose their own path, and of the price that sometimes has to be paid for the right to be oneself. What other hidden aspects of the Victorian era would you like to explore? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.